As far as killing its own citizens goes, the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea see eye to eye. Both these countries still have the death penalty. Their two systems are vastly different, and it's no secret that North Korea and the United States don't get along. Yet it's interesting to note that the death penalty is something both these countries have in common, even though most of the world has stopped using it for human rights reasons. As we examine death row in North Korea and the United States, there are many differences. There's also some similarities that might surprise you. Whether you agree with the death penalty or not, the fact remains both the United States of America and North Korea are two of 54 countries in the entire world that still use the death penalty. Just so we're clear, there are 141 countries that have outlawed the practice. So the US and North Korea are not in the majority. In 2020, Amnesty International recorded 483 executions in 18 countries. This means that although 54 countries may have the death penalty, they are not actually using it all the time. 2020 was a crazy year, but statistically there was a 26% decrease in executions from the previous year. China is still the world's leader in executions, but where do the United States and North Korea fall on this list? Due to the lack of data and information coming out of the DPRK, it's hard to say just how many executions happen per year. To be fair, the number will always be much higher than we think, because the government isn't held accountable to anyone but itself, so they can pretty much do whatever they want to its citizens. This includes making people disappear or killing them without cause. In a way, everyone in North Korea is on death row at all times. The United States, on the other hand, has a judicial system that allows for a fair trial. It's not a perfect system, and mistakes have been made in the past where people who were innocent have been executed, but at least there is some accountability. The US is also one of only 2 countries in the Americas that still has the death penalty, the other being Trinidad and Tobago. Although Trinidad and Tobago has not carried out an execution since 1979. The United States executed 17 people in the year 2020. This puts the US 6th on the list of the most executions in the last few years. The 5 countries ahead of the US are China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Egypt. However, it's a pretty safe bet that if we had any data from North Korea, it would be pretty high on the list. It's currently unknown how many people there are on death row in North Korea or even how many people have been executed. These statistics are closely guarded by the North Korean government, and they refuse to release crime statistics of any kind. What we do know of death row in North Korea comes mostly from defectors, and unfortunately not many of them make it out of the country alive. The United States does release data around the number of people from death row executed each year. In 2020, the number of executions dropped from the previous year by over 20%. On October 1, 2020, there were 2,553 inmates on death row in the U.S. There seems to be a trend of less people being executed in the U.S. each year, but only time will tell if this will continue. Unlike in North Korea, the death penalty varies by state in the U.S. As of right now, there are 27 states that still use the death penalty. This means that in the remaining 23 U.S. states, the death penalty is illegal. In North Korea, 100% of the country is subject to the death penalty. You may be wondering what can send someone to death row in North Korea versus the US. The crimes that can get someone sentenced to death in the 2 countries are actually quite similar. In both North Korea and the United States, someone can be given the death penalty for treason and espionage. However, only in North Korea can you be sentenced to death for political dissidence, consumption of media that has not been approved by the government, and practicing a form of religion other than the state ideology of Juche. However, like in North Korea, someone can get the death penalty in the US for murder, rape, and large-scale drug trafficking as well. Once someone has committed a crime punishable by death, both countries have different ways of going through the trial process. In North Korea, the government says everyone gets a trial where they can defend themselves in court. But by all accounts, it's just a charade. The trial is never fair, the verdict is most likely known going into the court, and that is even if someone's lucky enough to get to court. Oftentimes, the judiciary process is bypassed altogether, and the accused is just sent immediately to death row. In the United States, offenders are allowed to remain silent during the initial arrest and have a lawyer present during all future questioning. People in North Korea receive neither of these things. The defendant in the United States then gets a fair trial with an impartial jury, and the case is based on evidence. In an ideal situation, the defendant is innocent until proven guilty in the United States. However, in North Korea, if the government thinks you're guilty, you are guilty, no matter what. After being convicted and sent to death row in the United States, a defendant can still appeal their case, or a deal might even be made for a reduced sentence. This is to say there are options for death row inmates, especially those whose punishment may not fit the crime. There are no appeals, no deals, and no hope to be had if someone finds himself on death row in North Korea. Due to lack of information coming out of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, we may never actually know how many people are executed there each year. However, from sources such as defectors and human rights organizations that are trying to make sense of the matter, we do have a few statistics. For example, Amnesty International reported there were around 105 executions between 2007 and 2012 in North Korea. From news sources such as Daily North Korea and Radio Free Asia, it's been reported that 2 men and a woman were publicly executed by firing squad in 2021 for distributing South Korean movies in the country. These statistics are just the tip of the iceberg, and many believe that hundreds of people are being sentenced to death each year by the North Korean government. There have been approximately 300 people from death row executed in the United States over the last decade. It's hard to tell whether this is more or less than North Korea, but the conditions in the prison camps where people on death row wait for executions in North Korea are something straight from a nightmare. In the United States, prisoners at least get the basics. They receive food and occasional recreational time depending on the prison and crime. Mental illness tends to run rampant on death row in the US, and the cells can be uncomfortable, but there are legal and civil rights organizations that fight for prisoners' well-being. There's no denying that the mental health of death row inmates in the US could be taken a little more seriously, especially since the UN says more than 15 days in solitary confinement is torture. It's not uncommon for a death row inmate to spend much more than 15 days in solitary in the US. When sentenced to death row in North Korea, people are tortured, starved, and even murdered in the prison camps where they're held. These facilities aren't so much prisons as they are internment camps. It's sometimes referred to as a gulag system, reminiscent of the forced labor camps Joseph Stalin implemented in the Soviet Union. One of the main differences between people on death row in the two countries is that in North Korea, most prisoners don't even know what they're being detained for. There doesn't seem to be a distinction between petty criminals and those on death row in North Korea, as they're all sent to the same prison camps where they lose their basic human rights. In the United States, a prisoner cannot be sent to death row until after they are tried and found guilty. Within the North Korean prison camps themselves, death row inmates and everyone else are engaged in forced labor and torture. Routine executions and death from the conditions in the camps are reported to be common. So regardless of who you are or what you did, if you are in a North Korean prison camp, you are pretty much already on death row. In the United States, the execution of a death row inmate is planned well ahead of time. They know when they'll be put to death and are given a last meal. This doesn't mean waiting for your execution isn't scary, but at least the prisoner knows it's coming, and even what to expect, since the only means of execution currently in the US is lethal injection. In North Korea, a prisoner may not know what they are even being detained for, let alone what their sentence is or when it will be carried out. If you're unlucky enough to be on death row in North Korea, your execution could happen at any time and at any location. The main way death row prisoners are executed in North Korea seems to be by firing squad. That is, unless they die in the prison camp first. It has been reported that there are more gruesome ways that death row prisoners in North Korea have been executed. Depending on the crime, a firing squad might not be the method used. Prisoners could be hung or decapitated in public. These forms of execution seem to be reserved for high-ranking criminals such as officials convicted of drug trafficking or embezzlement, and those suspected of defecting or treason. The death penalty in the United States is a hot-button issue. Some are vehemently against it, while others support it. There are arguments to be made on both sides, and in the United States, people can have that debate. But what about in North Korea? Do the citizens of the country support the death penalty? Like most things in North Korea, it's hard to know. If you ask the government, North Koreans support everything they do, from working people to death in their prison camps to making sure their supreme leader lives a lavish lifestyle. But we all know this is just a show put on by the propaganda department of the country. What the people of North Korea believe or want is of no importance to the government. They are the ultimate authority, and anyone who disagrees with them may find themselves on death row. In 2019, the Transitional Justice Working Group, an NGO in South Korea, released a report that mapped out 318 sites where the North Korean government carried out public executions. In the United States, executions are no longer public and are carried out only in a handful of facilities. In North Korea, executions have taken place near rivers, markets, sports stadiums, and even schools. It's been suspected that during public executions in North Korea, family members and children are forced to watch their loved ones die. What it comes down to is that in North Korea, death row is somewhat of a free-for-all. There's not really a system in place other than if someone is believed to have committed a crime, they are found guilty without a real trial, sent to a prison camp to work and starve, and then publicly executed without any warning. In the United States, there's a process that leads to someone being sent to death row, and even this is becoming less and less prevalent over recent years. Now check out Death Row, Japan versus the United States. What's the difference? Or watch 50 insane death row facts nobody tells you.